This week on Dialogue, the swing vote, the untapped power of independence. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guest. Linda Killian is a journalist and senior scholar at the Wilson Center. She's been a writer and columnist for the Daily Beast Newsweek, Politico, and U.S. News & World Report. She's also written for the Washington Post and the New Republic, among others. Her previous book was The Freshman, Whatever Happened to the Republican Revolution. Her new book is this one, The Swing Vote, the untapped power of independence, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Linda, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let me first ask you, what inspired you to write a book about independent voters or so-called swing voters?
That's a good question. I've been writing about politics for more years than I care to admit, for several decades. And I had become increasingly concerned about the polarization and the dysfunction of government. And it occurred to me that this was a large group of voters that were really unrepresented, and which is borne out recently by a Gallup poll, which showed that 40% of all voters are registered unaffiliated or independent. That's more than either Democrats or Republicans.
The fastest growing party in America.
That's right.
The non-party.
Right. And I think their views are not being heard. I think they're not being represented. And I wanted to present their views in this book.
Did you invoke Thomas Paine early in the introduction, which a daring thing to do. Tell us about the use of Paine and the reference to common sense, and then how you do diagnose the problem.
I have different quotes from different founders throughout at the beginning of every chapter. I use Paine liberally. I'm a huge admirer of what he did with the revolution and common sense, which I think you can say lit the fuse of the revolution. And I think you can say he made the argument that it should be a people's revolution, which was a new idea, that a government should be of and by the people. There wasn't one on Earth at that point. And to some extent, I'm trying to invoke his spirit in the swing vote because I feel the same thing today. I feel the people are not being represented.
And so you're hoping, journalists as activists, you're hoping there'll be some reaction in a way that actually is a corrective, starts to get politics back on a track that's more functional.
Well, I'd like to see that. I have some ideas. I have some proposals toward the end of the book, not revolutionary things, but small things that I think the average person can do. I'd like to see the independent voters make their voices heard. And I think you have seen that to some extent in the early Republican primaries. In New Hampshire, half of the voters, where independent unaffiliated voters are permitted to participate, half of the voters were unaffiliated voters. And these independent voters, a lot of them voted for Ron Paul. I don't think they did it, and I've talked to some of them about it, not necessarily because they think Ron Paul should be president, but because they were trying to send a message, because he's the non-politician, because they feel he's a truth teller, because they feel he's not like both parties, which they think are pretty much the same.
So that is the message, is we don't like either party? Well, but isn't that somewhat impractical in a two-party world?
Well, there are different things you can do. You can run independent candidates, and you can try to exert pressure on the two parties to pay attention to you and to reform and to hold open primaries and to nominate more people in the middle and to try to work together.
Now, you decided to tell stories as one of the main narratives throughout the book. Was that just something that came natural to you as a journalist? You talk to people and tell their stories?
That's right. That's right. I mean, I didn't want it to be a sort of a boring polemic. And I wanted it to be accessible. And I wanted independent voters who largely don't feel the politicians are paying attention, largely don't feel the media are paying attention. I wanted them to say, that sounds like me. That sounds like the way I think. I agree with that. I'm glad to hear that voice of the 90-year-old great-grandmother in New Hampshire that I have, or the college student in Colorado, or the suburban mom in Virginia, or the policeman in Ohio. So you hear their voices.
The 90-year-old who says she plans to be around another 10 years still raising hell?
That's right. That's exactly right, yes.
I want to ask you about your selection process of the 4 states you use to be symbolic or representative of the larger group: New Hampshire, Virginia, Ohio, Colorado. And I think in the afterword you mentioned that wasn't what David Broder recommended, but with apologies to the dear departed. But how did you choose those 4? What is special about them that you thought helped tell this story?
I wanted to pick a manageable number of states that reflected to me key swing states that will be key in the 2012 election, but beyond, and that represented different areas of the country, different regions of the country. And that also I tied them in with a type of voter that I talk about, that are the type of independent voters. So I gave it an awful lot of thought. I spent months sort of thinking about the book before I actually started, reporting it.
How long have you been working on it?
2 years, I think it would be fair to say, altogether. And so I gave it a lot of thought. As you mentioned, I talked to David Broder. He was a friend and a mentor, and he had suggested Missouri and some other states. But I picked them. I thought they were interesting. I thought they were iconic. I thought they were terribly important. So Colorado represents the New West, the Rocky Mountain West. Large numbers of Hispanic voters, which is true in that region: Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. Excuse me. And a huge number of young people. The median age in Colorado is quite young, and more young people are registered as independents than anything else, and their percentage of independents is higher than any other age group. And Colorado is a beautiful and very interesting state. Ohio, to me, reflected the heartland and reflected its 19 electoral votes. Hard to see how no Republican president has been elected without Ohio. Only a couple of Democrats in 100 years. So Ohio is very pivotal. And it is the heartland. It has a little bit of everything. It has cities, it has farming, it has minorities, it has working class, it has everything, that represents Middle America. And there are a lot of what I call America First Democrats in Ohio. These are what people have thought of as Reagan Democrats. And they are definitely swing voters. They voted for Ronald Reagan if they're old enough. They voted for Bill Clinton. They voted for George Bush. Some of them voted for Barack Obama. They're very much up for grabs.
But they have this blue-collar union tradition that
right.
has made them traditionally Democratic families.
And they're more conservative socially than sort of the Democratic Party is thought to be. Virginia represents the New South. What's going on in the suburbs of Virginia, I think, is very, very emblematic of what's going on all over the South. The suburbs are no longer white. The suburbs have minorities represent a huge percentage of the suburbs, of all sorts, Asian, Hispanic, all sorts. That's happening in Northern Virginia.
I live in Northern Virginia. I see what you write about.
And suburban voters are definitely swing voters. They went for the Democrats in 2006. They went for Barack Obama in 2008, and they went big for the Republicans in 2010. They are a constituency. They vote their pocketbook to a certain extent. They vote their children's interests, security. They want what's good for them. And I call them the Starbucks moms and dads.
Moms and dads. And I wondered, is this an evolution of what we were talking about with soccer moms have evolved into Starbucks moms and dads?
Yeah, the same sort of idea.
Yeah.
I just thought it up. I don't know. It reminded me of they usually live near strip malls. They usually live near a strip mall where you can find a Starbucks. Yeah. And so I just thought of that. And then, of course, New Hampshire, of course, iconic first presidential primary in the country. New Hampshire voters, again, are interesting. They're more moderate on social issues, as is most of New England, more moderate on social issues, even Republican voters in New Hampshire. They have gay marriage in New Hampshire. They think you should be able to do what you want to do in the privacy of your own home. They don't believe in government getting involved in that, but they're very fiscally conservative. They don't like taxes. They don't like interference by the government in any way. And I call these voters the NPR Republicans.
And expand on that, because they listen to NPR?
They listen to NPR, and they're not ashamed to admit it.
And they would support continued funding for NPR, unlike the Republican National Party.
These voters tend to be quite different from the America First Democrats. They tend to be more affluent. They tend to be well-educated. As I say in the book, would not feel bad about going to an art gallery or an ethnic restaurant in the city. They're a little bit more sophisticated, more liberal on social issues, quite conservative on fiscal issues, think we should balance the budget, think we should, tackle the deficit. They don't like big government. A lot of them voted for Barack Obama in 2008. They were very distressed at the George W. Bush administration, at the war in Iraq, at the sort of disarray, mismanagement as they saw it, losing focus. And some of that they've seen in the Obama administration. And I think they've been disappointed. And they don't like the big government approach that they see from the Obama administration.
I don't think you mentioned your nickname for the Colorado contingent, the Facebook generation.
Thank you for reminding me. That's right, the Facebook generation, for those under 35, that I talk about the young voters.
So we now know how you selected the big picture and the 4 representative states. How about the individuals within the states? How did you find your subjects for interviews? Needle in a haystack.
By sheer legwork. And I interviewed many, sort of hundreds of people. And if any of them are watching this, I want to thank them. I thank them in the book. I dedicate the book to the independent voters. But they were very generous with their time. And what was interesting to me is I would get voter lists from secretaries of state and from voter registration offices. And I would call up total strangers and say, I'm a journalist in Washington, and I'm doing a book about politics and independent voters. These would be people registered as independents. And they would talk to me.
Well, that anecdotally supports your notion that their story is untold. They're eager to tell it.
They were very eager to tell it. I mean, not everyone I called.
Right.
Obviously, you get a call from a stranger. But a lot of people were very eager to talk. I did focus groups. I sought out specific people that were involved in some way in politics in their home states. I attended rallies. I attended during the 2010 campaign. I went out to Ohio and went to political events. Same thing in Colorado and New Hampshire. So I did sort of a variety of things to reach out to these voters.
We already mentioned the 90-year-old woman who is a self-identified firebrand, I believe is the term she used. Who are some of the other characters that you found most appealing, your favorites?
Well, another older woman, I have to say, was a woman in Colorado who she is a Republican. She's not an independent, but she's a moderate Republican.
Her vote's in play.
Her vote's in play. And she admitted to me she has voted for Democrats. I think she voted for the current Democratic governor of Colorado. And she is sort of an old, traditional, typical Republican. She was Speaker of the House. She was in the Senate, the first woman to do that. And she was just so funny and so kind of outspoken. And I wrote in the book, I have to look up her last name.
Sure.
I wrote in the book that I really hope I'm exactly like her when I'm her age.
A role model you had discovered in your journey.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I met so many interesting people.
I wonder about independence in general, and in reading your book, are we talking about frustrated Republicans and Democrats for the large part? In other words, when you see the Drew Weston kind of research on this about competing narratives in brains, that it's a very small percentage of people who have that most most of us either trend one way or the other, conservative, liberal, however you choose to characterize it, Republican, Democrat. What is your notion of these folks that you got to visit with and know? Are they frustrated Republicans and Democrats? Are they looking for a third way? Or are they something different? Are they these strange animals that actually view the world sort of almost bipolarly when it comes to politics?
That's a really good question. Before I answer it, Norma Anderson, I have to give her a shout out. Norma Anderson in Colorado. That's a really good question. And I think academics often argue that the independent voter is sort of a myth, and that people may be registered as independents but trend, as you said, Republican or Democrat. There certainly are people like that. Who are registered as independents for whatever reason. And I did talk to some of them who said they were independents but frequently voted Democrat or Republican. Those are not the voters I feature in the book, though. I talked to them, but I sort of set them aside. The voters I feature in the book are primarily those who do swing. That's why it's called the swing vote. They vote for candidates from both parties. And they are looking, part of it is they don't feel a natural home in either party. They don't feel either party totally reflects their views. Part of it is I think a lot of these people are registered independent on principle because they have a certain amount of disgust with typical politics and with what the two parties are doing, which they feel is pretty much the same as it relates to fundraising and lobbyist influence and negative campaigning and not being able to work together. And some of them, some of those I talked to said that they would favor the creation of a third party. Some of them didn't. They're independent, so there's no sort of uniformity in their thoughts on that. I think some of them think a third party, or some of them said, a European-style government, a fourth, fifth, or sixth party. Others felt that was impractical and would never happen, and they just wanted to see some change within the party system. So I think they're sort of all over the map. But I think of that 40%, the number I'm going with, and it's my number, of that 40% that are registered independent, I feel half of that group, or about 20%, are true swing voters who really change their minds.
Versus drifting Republicans or Democrats.
Yes. And so 20% of all voters is a significant...
Well, it's the difference in every race.
That's
More
right.
than the difference
That's
in every
right.
race.
It's the difference in statewide races, for sure.
You look at some historical context, too. You referenced the Perot campaign as the most successful independent presidential campaign in recent memory. Do you think there's an opening for a third party? I mean, you said that those you talked to had no consensus, but what do you think in researching this and in living this? Do you think that there is a real possibility to break the hammerlock of the two-party system and a new way emerging, or would it be an evolution of one of the other parties to satisfy this 40%?
Well, this year, I definitely think there's room for a third party this year. There is the group Americans Elect, which is working to get on the ballot in all 50 states. They have $20 million, which is not an insignificant amount of money to do that. It's going to be an online nominating process. They are going to nominate a candidate, and they will be on the ballot. My guess would be in most, if not all, of the 50 states. Mm-hmm. What percentage a candidate like that would get, who knows? Maybe 10%. In a time like this. You mentioned Ross Perot. He got 19% in 1992, which was a significant amount of the vote.
While dropping out and coming back.
Yes.
So he could have done even better.
That's right. And he was, I think, at best we can describe him as a sort of quixotic, sort of quirky candidate. So you can imagine how maybe a more serious independent candidate with the same message. He was talking about the deficit. He was talking about government spending. And Bill Clinton, I've heard Bill Clinton say, he credits Ross Perot for bringing that to the fore and for sort of getting people's attention about that. And a few years later, we had a balanced budget.
He credits him, but many Republicans blame him for getting Bill Clinton elected.
That's right.
That's the way they view it. What about this whole charge you've heard of independents of being sort of squishy? Neither fish nor fowl.
Right.
What did you encounter in that regard?
Well, I categorically reject that. I don't think that's fair. I think I'm a centrist myself. And I think if you tend to be progressive, or maybe that's not the word, moderate or liberal on social issues, if you don't think the government has a role to tell you who your partner should be, or whether you have the right to a legal abortion, you have an opinion on that. But you might also think at the same time that we need a balanced budget, that we need to tackle our very significant deficit. And we need to do something about that because it has a significant impact all over the place in the American economy. So I don't think that's squishy. I think independent voters have views. I think maybe they pick and choose. The Pew Research Center showed that independent voters agree more with the Republican Party on international affairs, on defense, on things like this, and they agree more with the Democratic Party on social issues. So they have views, they just are a mixture of both parties.
Does this lead, another criticism is that the centrist position leads to false equivalencies. So right now we see that, they're disgusted with both parties, but some make the case that the Republicans at this point in American history have been more obstructionist, that Obama has attempted to work with them. Or in your book you reference one of Joe Scarborough's comments about Frank Rich and Rush Limbaugh, which most people don't think is a fair balance. That Limbaugh is in a much more extreme character. Frank Rich writes columns that are based on evidence versus Rush Limbaugh, who just shoots from the hip. Do you think that there's this gravitation to false equivalency for someone who views themselves as an independent voter or centrist?
When I started the book, I started it with the idea that both parties were equally at fault. Equally at fault. And both parties had moved either to the left or right, and that they were unwilling to compromise, and they were both sort of responsible for the negative state of our current politics. I have to say that I think I totally started with an open mind. I have to say, I think in reporting the book, however, that I do think the Republicans are a little worse. I think the Tea Party has pushed them to the right. I think, the Tea Party may have many very fine points about the growth of government or what the size of government should be. That's fine. But they hold Republican candidates to a litmus test, and they scare Republican candidates. And they say either you agree with us on everything or we're going to run someone against you in the primary. And it has terrified moderate Republicans. You saw it with Mike Castle's defeat in Delaware. Mike Castle, I think there's no doubt, he had been governor of the state, he had been a congressman for many years. I think there's no doubt he would have easily been elected senator, but couldn't get through a Republican primary with a rather goofy candidate. You saw the same thing with Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. The Tea Party, and I write pretty extensively about that, and I have a lot of respect for her. The Tea Party ran a candidate against her. He beat her, not decisively. He beat her. She said, I'm running as a write-in candidate. And she did it. And she won in the general election. Alaskans, which also Alaska has a lot of independent voters, they probably tend to be somewhat more conservative, again, liberal on social issues, but they elected her.
There's the momentum you're describing with the examples you use. Is this suggesting that the independent vote will belong to Democrats in the general election because of the impact of the Tea Party in the primaries? For the foreseeable future, look, these things change. It's all cyclical.
I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that. In the presidential election, you mean? I think the independents have not yet decided. I think they're waiting to see who the Republicans nominate. I think Mitt Romney has, he can appeal to the independents, I think, in terms of not being so conservative. That, of course, has hurt him in the Republican primaries. They don't quite know where he stands. His record is somewhat more moderate, having been governor of Massachusetts, and that has hurt him with the conservative Republican base. But I think independents would probably be a bit turned off by some of his business credentials and by some of the things that people are saying about him in terms of his record in the private sector, because independents feel that the government and big business and that they don't have the average person's concerns in mind, and that there's one set of rules for big business and executives and bankers and Wall Street people and members of Congress, and there's another set for the average person. And I think that's a bit reflected in some of Mitt Romney's records.
So this is where the Tea Party and Occupy movement meet, this sense of unfairness.
That's exactly right. I think they're not sold on Obama. I think they're disappointed on Obama. I think many of them did vote for him in 2008. So I think probably they will make up their minds in October of 2012 about who they're going to vote for.
And they will certainly be the difference maker. We only have a couple of minutes remaining, but I wanted to ask you about some of the areas for action based on solutions that you reference in the book, campaign finance, redistricting. And in a couple of minutes we have, what would you highlight as potential solutions to this sort of partisan logjam that leaves independents on the sidelines?
Well, I'll mention a few. I want to leave a few. I want people to buy the book. So
we won't give everything away.
We won't give everything away. And I want them to meet some of these individuals that I talk about. But I think probably some of the things I talk about are something I feel very passionately about is we should have open primaries in all 50 states. Independents, we saw it in New Hampshire, we saw it in Iowa. South Carolina independents are participate in the primary. Independents should be allowed to vote.
Mike Castle would certainly have supported
in the primaries.
Right?
I mean,
that's where it makes a difference in a race like that.
The electoral system is paid for by government taxpayer dollars. Mm-hmm. It is undemocratic, frankly, that independents cannot vote in the primaries. And I think you would see different kind of candidates coming out of the primaries if independents were permitted to vote. So I think that's a big change that should really be pushed for. I think we should push for redistricting reform in congressional districts. I think the way that congressional districts are designed, there are maybe 60 in the country that are truly competitive, and the rest are either sort of safe Democratic or safe Republican seats. The politicians have the power to handle the redistricting, so they do it for themselves. They carve out safe districts for themselves, and that makes it less competitive, and they less have to appeal to the center in their campaigns.
So these are some of the ideas that would sort of break the logjam and get us to more than just you reporting about independence, someone else. We didn't even talk about the role of the press. That's another issue that maybe we can talk about after the election, a debrief.
Sure.
But thank you for joining us. This is the book, The Swing Vote, from our guest Linda Killian. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.